Hi, my name's Mike Snow, and I want to talk about this book, Explorers of the Nile by Tim Geel. This is a fantastic book. I did a video a while back where I reviewed The Scramble for Africa by Thomas Pakenham, and I said I wanted to read a book about the earlier exploration of Africa, pre-Scramble, and this is that book. This is fantastic. This is about Speke and Baker and Stanley and Livingston and Richard Burton, and their amazing adventures, primarily in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in exploring Central and East Africa, trying to find the source of the Nile. That's what they're trying to do. It was a millennia-old mystery dating back to ancient Egypt. Where does the Nile originate? Where does it start? No one was able to discover it. They were using Ptolemy to try to find out where exactly this river was. And Ptolemy was a little bit accurate based on where they actually found it. Near the Ruwenzori, the Mountains of the Moon in East Africa, at Lake Victoria. This is an amazing book. The adventure that these people go on is fantastic. It really reminds me why the two genres, especially in film, are divided up as action-adventure, and most of the things in that are just plain action films, but adventure is a very different thing. It's an exciting mixture of different events, of travel and the hardship of the road, and occasionally there's fighting when people are attacked. There are cannibals in this story. There are people desperately trying to fight off traps from enemies. It says at one point that Stanley had to march into an area of jungle, and the people there had buried little poisoned punji stakes in the ground, and they had to carefully pull up the traps in order to march through. And they were firing at each other, and there were slave raiders, and there were villages being burned down. These were some of the most heroic adventures in all of human history. It begins more or less in the 1850s with Livingston, who was one of the earliest people to call for exploration in the area and also call for it to be civilized and colonized. And it ends with the final discovery and recognition of where the source of the Nile is, and everything that goes on in between, from the heat and the disease and the starvation, but also the beauty of the landscape and the people, and being in an entirely alien landscape near something romantically called the Mountains of the Moon. It's a wonderful adventure, and it doesn't skip over the dark sides of this adventure. Like I said, there are cannibals, and there's lots and lots of death and hardship, and it's just an amazing story all through. And reading about all of these people in this alien landscape, to march in there, it's easy to travel now. You could go anywhere in the world on a plane, but back then, there were huge blank spaces on the map, and nobody knew it was there. And they were walking into it would be the equivalent of if we went to an alien planet. That's how amazing it is that these adventurers did all this 150 years ago. The first half of the book is all about these adventurers and their amazing travels all throughout East Africa trying to find the source of the Nile, and all of the myriad adventures they encounter along the way, and all the suffering they go through, and how amazing it is when they actually accomplish their goal. But the thing that really sets this book out and makes it unique and made it amazing was that there's an entire second section of this book that goes into the longer-term political consequences of the explorers, and that was brilliant. That was a great idea, and that makes this amazing, because in the second part of the book we see what the results of this exploration was. It doesn't just end there with the adventure. We see what it meant to the people of Africa and Europe to have these explorations done, and it goes through the sad, sorry legacy of Uganda, Sudan, and the Congo, and all of the terrible things that happened afterwards. In this book is the real origin to what has been happening in South Sudan in recent days, and also in northern Uganda. If you remember the Kony 2012 from a few years ago, this is the real origin to that. I have been bothered by reading news stories, even in papers that I think are, that I trust as being genuinely more left-wing about things, in how little they want to talk about the history of Sudan. I read, I think, an article in The Guardian, a paper I usually trust, and when it said the origins of the conflict going on right now in South Sudan, but it goes back a couple of years. It doesn't even go back a decade. It barely goes back past the creation of South Sudan as a state. This is where you need to go for an overview of the real origins to the troubles in South Sudan and the troubles with Kony in northern Uganda. And it almost all has to do with European explorers. You see, there was originally a lost province, we might call it now, called Equatoria. It was named by an explorer who was going south from Egypt into Sudan in what is now northern Uganda, and he recognized this one area of land that would now encompass this geographical setting that would encompass South Sudan and northern Uganda. Northern Uganda is where Kony has been terrorizing people for the past few decades. No longer. He's in probably in the eastern Congo now, somewhere in the jungle. The similarities of language, religion, ethnicity of the people there, of their way of life, of the geographic setting, everything about this seems to indicate that this should have been made its own country. South Sudan had been, for centuries, a more sub-Saharan African zone that hadn't yet been penetrated by Islam, that was derided and hated by the people in northern Sudan. Unfortunately, when the British took over the country in the late 1800s, they immediately identified with the northern people in Khartoum, the northern Sudanese, and sort of took on their hatred and disgust for the more traditionally African and less Islamic people in South Sudan, leading to the troubles nowadays. A century ago, there were people working in this area who were talking about how we needed to help the people of South Sudan, how it was not going to work if the people of North Sudan were controlling them, people that were linguistically and ethnically totally different, and who hated the people of South Sudan and thought that they were little better than animals and treated them as slaves just before the British came. Now, that isn't to somehow reject that the people of North Sudan had any responsibility for what they did later on after the British left, but the origins for this ethnic strife was the creation of a modern nation-state and giving control of this large swathe of land in the south of Sudan to people that were not that hated South Sudan, that hated the people, that treated them almost as children or even almost as animals. They loathed them so much. And that is the real origin of it. It happened a century ago. They knew this. It's painful to read that they knew, the British, a century ago, that the northern Sudanese could not be left to control the South, and that they hated the people of the South, and that they were leaving them to be underdeveloped and forgotten about. And that caused, ultimately, the conflict in Darfur and the separation in South Sudan. After the British left, there was an immediate civil war that was fought decades ago, and it just sort of broiled and fumed and never really left until this present day. And it really distresses me when I see papers, especially papers like The Guardian, trying to paint this conflict in such simplistic terms, and especially exclusively African terms, as if there's no part that the Europeans played over a century ago when they knew that this was a bad idea. They knew they shouldn't join these two parts into a single country. They knew that South Sudan wouldn't fit into the North, to put it mildly. And the fact that that's there is... the fact that that happened is outrageous, and it should be something that everybody knows. That's why history is important, so you know the real origins of this conflict between these two groups. Northern Uganda suffered a similar fate because that part of northern Uganda really should have been blended in to southern Sudan to create one nation of Equatoria, or I don't know what you exactly call it, but that should have been its own independent nation. It shouldn't have arbitrarily sliced off these pieces in the middle and gave one to Sudan and one to Uganda, both groups that had no real connection to these people in any way. So when you look at this book, I try to urge people, don't look at this as some sort of this empty Victorian adventure that these European explorers. This is vitally important to some of the hottest conflict zones in the world today, and it's vitally important that you get the real history, not the diluted history of the past decade of how just recently things came to this, but the history of how it actually happened over a century ago. And like I said, I don't want to make it entirely the Europeans or the Africans' fault. There's both parties there to blame. This was an amazing book. The adventure stories are really exciting. I love a good rip-roaring Victorian adventure of people exploring unknown vistas thousands of miles away from civilization in Europe. I love that, but it also goes into the wonderful and vitally important history to understand that part of the world today and the Europeans' interaction with it. I really think you should get this book. It's amazing.